to the latest edition of Zag's APUSH from the Underground Garage. We're coming at you today with a brief discussion. I'm going to try to make this as quick as possible on the Reconstruction era. So we're really in topics 5.10, 5.10, and 5.11 in our APUSH guide book. And we're also in period 5, 1844 through 1877. So that's where we're at. I'm going to make this a quick lecture. It's not going to be all that jazz. So it's just going to be straightforward. So let's begin. I cut and pasted some things from the History Channel as well as from the Library of Congress that I thought was important, as well as our friend Eric Foner. So let's begin with Reconstruction. George Washington said, at least in the Hamilton production, winning was easy, governing is harder. This would once again come to fruition after the Civil War with Lee's surrender at Appomattox in April of 1865. The conflict that existed before and during the Civil War between regions, political parties, and economic interests continued after the war. While the Southern social hierarchy still desired cheap labor to work the plantations, freedmen and women desired a new birth of freedom that was promised to them by the eventual amendments to the Constitution, most notably the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. In the end, Reconstruction would last from 1863 to 1877 formally, but its legacy is still debated even to this day. Our first question to consider is who had the authority to commence reconstructing the South, and in turn, the nation itself? Was it the president, Lincoln, or was it Congress? In 1863, Lincoln developed a plan entitled the Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. The plan called for full presidential pardons to Confederates who took an oath of allegiance to the Union and to the Constitution, and to accept the emancipation of slaves. In addition, a state government could reestablish and be accepted by the federal government as soon as 10% of its voters took state loyalty oaths. This plan was not very well received by the so-called radical Republican faction of Congress. Members like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner wanted a more aggressive plan towards Reconstruction. As a result, Congress passed the Wade-Davis Bill in 1864. This bill required a 50% loyalty oath to Lincoln's 10%. When the bill came to Lincoln's desk for its final signature, Lincoln refused to sign it and in turn pocket vetoed the bill after Congress was adjourned. Lincoln felt secession was illegal and the Confederacy was not a legitimate government and wanted to restore the Union as quick as possible, holding on to the notion that he had since the early days of his presidential campaign of 1860. By 1865, we saw the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, which would take steps to help freedmen and women providing food, shelter, and medical aid. This bureau also worked in educating freed blacks. Remember, education and land ownership were two avenues that African Americans felt was the key to democracy. The Bureau established nearly 3,000 schools, including several colleges such as Howard and Morehouse universities. Unfortunately, federal funding would stop in 1870 and would foreshadow the lack of commitment by the North and the South, federal and state governments, towards Reconstruction. Reconstruction would take a different approach after the assassination of Lincoln in April of 1865. Vice President Andrew Johnson took the oath of office with the welcoming of Congress at first. Johnson came from humble beginnings who grew up in rural Tennessee and hated the planter class. Johnson was a Southern Democrat who, as Senator of Tennessee, remained loyal to the Union. In addition, Johnson, as a result of his upbringing, hated the planter class of the social aristocracy. While this would make him appeal to radical Republicans, his true form of white supremacy quickly came to fruition. Johnson is the case study for the color line that was drawn between poor whites and the slave, now freed class in our social hierarchy. But when Johnson was growing up and a young man, it was the slave class, obviously. The relationship between Johnson and Congress dwindled quickly as part of Johnson's Reconstruction plan. Johnson's plan closely resembled Lincoln's plan of leniency towards Reconstruction. The most questionable action from Johnson was how he retained power to grant individual pardons to disloyal Southerners. This in turn was an escape clause for the wealthy plantation class. Although Johnson disliked the planter class, and to the surprise of the Republicans in Congress, Johnson utilized this pardon often. This again proves how Johnson is the case study for this color line that was drawn between the classes of the social pyramid. By the fall of 1865, many ex-Confederates were back in office due to Johnson's pardoning. With Southern governments back in place and even ex-Confederate leadership now sitting in Congress, the New South would closely resemble the Old South. While slavery kept the social hierarchy in check prior to the Civil War, black codes were put in place after the war due to the abolition of slavery in the 13th Amendment. These actions angered the radical Republicans and made them question who actually won the war. Johnson further alienated the Republican Party, including moderate Republicans, with his vetoing with the increase of service to the Freedmen's Bureau. Remember, the Freedmen's Bureau was a relief organization for freed slaves. In addition, he also vetoed the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, which would eventually be overridden by a 2/3 vote in Congress. Johnson's actions towards this legislation shows his true support for that color line, again, coming back to that notion that Zinn put in place during our summer reading. While he may have resented the planter class, his actions surely supported the social hierarchy. The rift between Johnson and Congress would lead to phase 2 of Reconstruction, or what we're going to call Congressional Reconstruction. The Republicans in Congress were split, with moderate Republicans looking for more opportunities for white middle-class citizens and radical Republicans, such as Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens and Massachusetts Senator Charles Brooks. Yes, he is healed from the caning from the 1850s, if you remember the Sumner Brooks incident. They were looking for full equality towards blacks. Besides the Civil Rights Act, the radical Republicans pushed 2 constitutional amendments through. The 14th Amendment, as Eric Foner argues, is the most important amendment since the Bill of Rights, and it guarantees all persons born or naturalized in the United States to be citizens, and the states and the federal government are obligated to protect equal protection of the laws to all citizens. This granting full citizenship to African Americans and thus overturning the Supreme Court decision under the Dred Scott ruling. While this act was geared towards helping African Americans, it did, however, have blowback to the radical Republican agenda. Under the 14th Amendment, the federal government had no authority to confiscate land of plantation owners, ex-Confederates really, and redistribute it to its freed people. In turn, the federal government would never stay true to the notion of 40 acres and a mule. Radical Republicans looked to have the South under a military jurisdiction to enforce federal policies to support African American equality. So what we see here is part of this phase 2 Reconstruction. This is where Congress is pushing Johnson over to the wayside because of what we're going to see in a minute here with his impeachment, and by his vetoing of the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which was also overridden by Congress. And by 1867, this relationship between Congress and Johnson has come to a fever pitch, and they baited Johnson with the Tenure of Office Act as a way to impeach Johnson. Remember, he was impeached. That does not mean he was removed from office, and he was not removed from office. As a result of this impeachment, phase 2 of Reconstruction would begin, and this is known again as Congressional Reconstruction, which is a much more aggressive form of Reconstruction. This is where you have Union troops occupying the South and enforcing obviously the 13th, but also the 14th and then the 15th Amendments, and also having the carpetbaggers and the scalawags in the South controlling government. So while Johnson was in office, you had a more the ex-Confederates were taking control, the Democrats were taking control, and then those guys were out once Congressional Reconstruction started after the impeachment of Johnson. And you're going to have these Republicans, what they're going to be known as, if they are Northerners coming down, they're going to be called carpetbaggers, or they're going to be called scallywags, or Republicans that are from the South. So the next part of the lecture here is going to be coming from the History Channel. Successor. So Grant becomes, after you have Johnson, after the Johnson administration, You have the election of Ulysses S. Grant. They go with the war hero. And Grant is trying to do the right thing. And Grant is noted in the Chernow book, which I still have to read the whole thing, but he talks about how it was truly a mess. What he's trying to do, he's trying to support the Republican Party with sending troops down there, but he also doesn't want to send troops down there. You know, he has seen the horrors of war, and he does not want to send troops down to the South. He did, however, eradicate with federal troops the Ku Klux Klan in states like Tennessee, which was, again, proving that this military rule of the South was helping with the advancement of African Americans to really start moving towards that social ladder, moving up and having political, economic, and social democracy. But by the time you get to 1876, at the end of the Grant administration, that was plagued also with corruption, Democratic candidate Samuel Tilden, governor of New York, emerged with a lead of more than 260,000 popular votes, but Tilden had amassed only 184 electoral votes, one shy of the number needed to defeat his Republican opponent, Governor Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. You're going to have the Compromise of 1877. A political compromise was dealt in 1877, and in tone, you would have Rutherford B. Hayes become president of the United States as a Republican, and in turn, Hayes would remove Union troops from the South. Okay, so they would remove any type of military jurisdiction from the South. This next part is from the Library of Congress. As Eric Foner recounts in his book Forever Free, the story of the Emancipation and Reconstruction, Hayes had pledged in his acceptance of the nomination to bring the blessings of honest and capable local self-government to the South if elected, a statement that could be taken as code for ending Reconstruction. In fact, even as the Electoral Commission deliberated, National Party leaders had been meeting in secret to hash out what would become known as the Compromise of 1877. Hayes agreed to cede control of the South to Democratic governments and back away from attempts at federal intervention in the region, as well as place Southerners in his cabinet. In return, Democrats would not dispute Hayes' election and agreed to respect the civil rights of African Americans. So now the Union troops are out. The Democratic governors and state legislators are back in, and they're promising to support black rights, which we know is not going to happen. Soon after his inauguration, Hayes made good on his promise, ordering federal troops to withdraw from Louisiana and South Carolina, where they had been protecting Republicans to the governorship in those states. This action marked an effective end to the Reconstruction era and began a period of solid Democratic control in the South that would last into the 1960s. For their part, white Southern Democrats did not honor their pledge to hold the rights of black citizens, but moved quickly to reverse as many of Reconstruction policies as possible. By 1900, so now we're looking at this from the lens of where are we at by the turn of the century, where are we at with race relations and the end of Reconstruction? By 1900, the status of the South looked very much like the Old South. The Supreme Court weighed in with the racial strife in America with their ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson. This is coming from the court dockets now. The court held that the state law was constitutional. In an opinion authored by Justice Henry Billings Brown, the majority upheld state-imposed racial segregation. Justice Brown conceded that the 14th Amendment intended to establish absolute equality for the races before the law, but held that separate treatment did not imply the inferiority of African Americans. The court noted that there was not a meaningful difference in the quality between the white and black railway cars. Again, that's what they were suing over. In short, segregation did not itself constitute unlawful discrimination. We get the precedent of separate but equal out of the Plessy case. There was, however, a lone dissenting opinion by John Marshall Harlan, and he argued that the Constitution was colorblind and that the United States had no class system. Accordingly, all citizens should have equal access to civil rights. With segregation becoming the norm in the South, Southern law enforcement turned a blind eye to the violence and intimidation toward African Americans. Lynching was one of the forms of disgusting violence toward African Americans, due in part that the whites felt that the African Americans were becoming too free. Politically, disenfranchisement of black voters throughout the South became common, often through intimidation and violence such as from the Ku Klux Klan. And they helped to ensure the racial segregation imposed by these new Jim Crow laws, a system that endured for more than a half century until the advances of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. In the end, Reconstruction did not accomplish its immediate goals due to the lack of commitment by the federal and state governments. Eric Foner argues that Reconstruction had good intentions in the short term, but in the long term, it would forever laminate a basis for equality for African Americans and other social groups for their plight to become part of what we would see in the county election paintings. This is Zags APUSH. Strive for the 5. We'll see you soon. Have a great night.